Today we're going to be talking about slavery. And we're talking about stuff today. Let's go ahead and start off by making our section title, which is slavery. So section title, slavery, and then underline. So when we're talking about slavery, we're going to talk about slavery and we're going to talk about the ancient origins first, and then we'll move into the transatlantic slave trade era. All right, first bullet here, we're going to write down ancient origins. So bullet, ancient origins. So first thing for slavery, we're going to talk about the ancient origins of slavery and how it used to work way back in time. We're talking about in 2000, 1000 before Common Era. So talking about, 3 or 4,000 years ago, how it used to work. So how it used to work is that we can see examples of slavery in this time period of 1000, 2000 before Common Era. We can see that in Greece, we can see it in Rome, we can see it in China. So we see it in quite a lot of places. We see kind of this ancient form of slavery. Go ahead and make a 1, and we're going to write down Greece, Rome, and China. So we can see in pretty much all these ancient civilizations. You can see it also in ancient India and such as well. So pretty much, if there was an ancient civilization, they did have some type of form of slavery. So how did these forms of slavery, how are they different from the kind of transatlantic slave trade era of working on cotton plantations? Well, the way it was worked is that it wasn't widespread. It wasn't like through everywhere. Not everybody was a slave or a free person, so it wasn't this widespread thing. There wasn't this huge slave trade, so it wasn't like you didn't have people doing this massive economy just based purely on slavery and having slave workers. You didn't see that. So it wasn't widespread and it wasn't this huge trade. And it was only for one generation only. Make it 2. Write down one generation only. And I'll explain what that means. So one generation only, what that means is that if someone was a slave and they had kids, those kids would not be slaves. Okay, so in ancient slavery, way back in the day, if you had children, those children weren't slaves. Just a person who was a slave was a slave. A slave could even marry someone who wasn't a slave and they could totally have kids. So marriage was allowed, for example, and such. And you could buy your freedom as well. So it was a lot different than what slavery became. So yeah, you could marry kind of who you wanted. You could earn money. You could buy your freedom. All right, so it was a lot different than what slavery became. At this time period, slaves were a symbol of wealth and they weren't a source of wealth. Going to write it down for number 3. So number 3, slaves are a symbol of wealth, not a source of wealth. So slaves were never, at this time period in ancient times, they weren't a source of wealth. Sure, there were areas in which there were people that did own slaves and those slaves were a source of wealth for those people, but it wasn't again widespread. All right, so there were slaves, but generally speaking, they were a symbol of wealth. It's, like someone wearing a super expensive ring, for example. That's pretty much what slavery was for a lot of people. It was just like, I'm a rich person. I'm so rich, I own this person. All right, that's really what it was for a lot of people. Now, there were places where slaves were a source of wealth. Like I said, there were some large landowners that had slave farm workers. So there were some places like that, especially in Sparta. Sparta's entire economy was based on slavery. So there were some places in which slaves were definitely a source of wealth. But for the most part, they were more of a symbol and they weren't so much a source. But in some places, they were. But for the most part, just mainly a symbol of, some dude being rich. All right. So how is it that people became a slave in ancient slavery? If it wasn't based on people being born a slave, how did people become slaves? Well, let me talk to you about that. Let's make a bullet and write down initial enslavement. So bullet, initial enslavement. So for initial enslavement, there was 4 basic ways that someone could become a slave. The first one was prisoner of war. So if China fought against some other kingdom like Vietnam, Korea, Mongolians, and when they defeated those people, they would take anybody that lost in that war, they would capture them, right? And then they would sell them into slavery. So that was one of the ways in which there was initial enslavement. So a lot of times when people fought wars, they wanted to capture people so that either one, they could ransom them back off if they were some rich dude, or sell them into slavery and make money that way. Now that was a way of paying for wars, was capturing rich people and ransoming them off, or capturing a whole bunch of ordinary people and selling them into slavery. All right, so that was one way, prisoners of war. Make one, write down prisoners of war. The second way that people became initially enslaved was kidnapping. So just straight up, some kid being nabbed. All right. That's why it's called kidnapping, because it's a kid getting nabbed. All right. That's what it is. So yeah, just straight up, just a kid being grabbed, bam, and there you go. So illegal, obviously, that's kidnap somebody. But that is one way how people were sold into slavery, was being kidnapped at a young age. 3, non-payment of debt. So if you owe somebody a whole bunch of money and you just could not pay off that money, you could sell yourself into slavery to pay off the amount of money that you owed to that person. So self-slaving, basically. So you would just sell yourself into slavery, and then you would use that money to pay off the person that you had that you owed money to. So that was one way of doing it as well. 4, criminal acts. So someone committed a crime, but the crime wasn't serious enough to warrant the death penalty, then that person could be sold into slavery. So you probably wouldn't want a slave that stole stuff like, thief or anything. But, it could be someone getting into fights, for example, could be sold into slavery. It could be for someone that steal things, could be sold into slavery as well. So a lot of those things like that. So a criminal act could end up with someone being sold into slavery. And like I said before, even as a slave, like you could sell yourself off to somebody as a slave, and then after being a slave, you could then earn enough money to then buy your freedom. So you could sell yourself off, pay off your debts, and then work for that person as a slave, for somebody else as a slave, earn enough money, bam, buy your freedom. So yeah, it was possible to kind of get out of slavery at this time period. All right, so as I said before, slavery, this is kind of how slavery was, but eventually it ends up changing. Gonna make a new bullet and write down transatlantic slave trade. So new bullet and write down transatlantic slave trade. So the transatlantic slave trade, that slave trade occurred after the kind of 1400s is when we're talking about transatlantic slave trade. And the transatlantic slave trade was simply the buying and selling of slaves from Africa over to the Americas. And then people then, after they sold slaves in the Americas, then buying stuff that they were making in the Americas and then bringing that over to Europe and selling it in Europe. So that's basically how it kind of works. So you start up in Europe, you bring stuff down to Africa to sell, you pick up slaves, sell the slaves in America, pick up stuff that they were selling, go back to Europe, sell the stuff from the Americas in Europe, grab stuff in Europe that Africa wanted, bam, sell it there, grab the slaves, go here, so forth and so on. That's why it's called. So that's the transatlantic slave trade. That's how it kind of worked. So as that bullet, transatlantic slave trade. And we need to talk about ethnocentrism. So the transatlantic slave trade was based on simply the selling of people from Africa into slavery. And a lot of the just selling people from Africa into slavery was based on a term called ethnocentrism. Go ahead and make a 1 and write this down. Ethnocentrism, the belief in the inherent superiority of one's own ethnic group or culture. Okay, so ethnocentrism. Let me kind of break down what that is while you guys are writing it down. Ethnocentrism is when you have one group or ethnic group. We'll use the British for example. So you might have a group of people like the British, and the British might think of themselves as being superior compared to other people. So, like people in Africa, for example. And therefore, because they thought themselves as being superior to people in Africa, it was just natural for British people to be like, oh, hey, the reason why we have better technology and we have all this stuff compared to what Africans have, it's because we're just naturally better than them. They suck. All right. That was the opinion that a lot of Europeans had this time period, was that their ethnic group was just, better, superior to anybody else's ethnic group. So Africans, Asians, didn't matter. You sucked if you weren't British. Okay, so that's basically how it kind of worked. Now we do see ethnocentrism pop up even in Asia when we see the Japanese, when they become powerful in 1900 to 1945. We see how they believe themselves to be superior to everybody else, and they use that as justification for brutalizing the Koreans when they take them over, when they take over Manchuria, when they're invading China. So we do see this ethnocentric view pop up not only in Europe, but we also see it pop up in Japan as well when you have the Empire of Japan kind of going pretty strong. So ethnocentrism, as I said, was when you think your ethnic group is superior to others. Alrighty. Next thing, 2, economic motivations. So ancient slavery, as we said before, is more of like hey, I'm so rich I own a person. In the transatlantic slave trade era, it becomes, hey, I'm a rich person. I want to make even more money. So I don't want to pay people all that much. So yeah, I'm going to use cheap labor. And that's really what it became down to. It's like, hey, I want to use cheap labor to farm all this land I have and make myself even more money. All right. So that's how economic motivated. That's how it kind of became. So it's based on economic motivations for cheap labor. So why do they need this cheap labor for? Well, they could get cheap labor from from Europe. So when you had British people coming over to the Americas and they had all this land and everything they had kind of bought up and they wanted to farm it, the problem was they could get cheap labor from Europe. There were poor people that they could bring over by boat to work on their lands and so forth. The problem is they couldn't get enough poor people from Europe to come over and work in the Americas. So because they couldn't get enough poor people to come over and work for a cheap price, they're like, well, whatever, we'll just force people then. And so that's where it also becomes as well when you get the transatlantic slave trade going. Go ahead and make a 3 3. And we're going to write down not enough workers. So 3, not enough workers. So that happens because of not enough workers. Now you would think, oh, hey, weren't there already people living in the Americas? Couldn't they just use like Native Americans for slaves? Well, mostly Native Americans, like, 80% of them, 90% of them kind of got wiped out by smallpox. So yeah. Also, apparently Native Americans didn't make very good slaves. I don't remember the reason why. I just remember they didn't make good slaves. Same things apparently with people from India. Also, apparently they didn't work out well as slaves either. Again, don't know why. Just remember that was something I read. Apparently Africans were just the preferred choice. I don't know what that is. All right. And number 4, late 1400s. So when's the transatlantic slave trade occur? When does it start? Late 1400s is when it starts. All right. Next time, we'll talk more about the transatlantic slave trade. We'll talk about when people from Africa were coming over to the Americas, what culturally they were able to keep the same. So, like culturally, from their culture from West Africa, what they were able to keep. We already mentioned before about how traditional West African religion, how that then develops into Buddhism in the Americas. So that's a tradition that people from West Africa were able to keep. So we'll talk about that. And we'll talk about culture-wise things that changed for people being forced from Africa to the Americas. All right. We'll talk about that next time.